inhumane torture carried out on prisoners throughout the Second World War was often disguised as scientific experimentation. Many of the doctors who carried them out believed that these sacrifices were essential for the advancement of knowledge, while others only wanted to see the enemy suffer for racial reasons. The most terrible of these behaviors did not occur in Europe, but in the extreme east of the Asian continent. In today's video, we are going to learn in detail about the bloodthirsty experiments carried out by what is known as Unit 731, a secret collective of the Japanese Empire dedicated specifically to this type of tortuous research and experiments. Prepare for a trip to the most gruesome dungeons in China, where rivers of innocent blood fueled modern science. Welcome once again to military history. World War II was a storm of destruction that marked the lives of more than 100 million people around the planet. Among the horrors of war that unfolded, none generates as much rejection as the conflict known as the Pacific Theater. During this conflict, a heartbreaking confrontation took place, the invasion of the Japanese Empire into Chinese territory. It was a maelstrom of expansionist interventions with a conquering thirst that would leave indelible scars in Asia. Within this brutal confrontation, a dark shadow emerged that overshadows even the most sinister atrocities: the operations of Unit 731, the Japanese biological warfare unit that plunged the already genocidal combat to new depths. From humble beginnings as a public health and research agency, this division evolved into a deadly disease factory. Known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, they were capable of decimating the world's population on multiple occasions if their extermination protocol had been fully implemented. This aberrant progress unfolded with the unimaginable suffering of the Chinese captives. These were used as test subjects and walking disease carriers until the closure of Unit 731 at the end of the war in 1945. However, before its disbandment, this unit perpetrated some of the most tortuous and cruel human experiments in all of history.
So, since we had to execute the logs anyway, we believed that it was, in fact, an honorable act on our part to give them the opportunity to offer their bodies to contribute to the development of the human race.
Freezing. In the darkest abysses of the facilities of this sinister Japanese group, led by physiologist Yoshimura Hisato, the most unimaginable horrors were unleashed in the name of science. Hisato, with a peculiar interest in hypothermia, immersed himself in freezing experiments using human prisoners as his tragic test subjects. With a method as cold as his inhumanity, he immersed the captives' limbs in a tub of frozen water until a cruel layer of ice formed on their skin. He precisely timed the time it took for human bodies to develop frostbite injuries, while the sound of frozen limbs echoed like a thud in the cold torture room. In his ruthless quest to understand the human body's responses to extreme temperatures, Hisato explored various ways to quickly thaw frozen appendages, from dousing the limbs with boiling water to subjecting them to direct fire, or simply leaving the subject untreated overnight while he screamed in despair. Each method revealed new dimensions of suffering. Witness statements narrate a horrifying concert of pain, where the limbs, once frozen, emitted a macabre sound, similar to the creaking of a wooden board hit with a cane. The twisted Japanese scientist subjected his victims to this torture, exploring the limits of human resistance to the unimaginable, without any mercy. Unit 731, in its twisted scientific logic, came to cruel but real conclusions. They demonstrated that the most effective treatment for frostbite was to submerge the limbs in water slightly warmer than 100 degrees, but never exceeding 122 degrees. This was because the higher the temperature, the greater the damage that was generated on the individual's flesh, leading to death from pain. In this macabre dance of experimentation, science veered toward barbarism, and the victims of Unit 731 were crystallized like ice forever, in the darkest pages of history. Vivisection. In the deepest bowels of the laboratories of Unit 731, the procedure called vivisection, an aberrant practice that consisted of performing operations on living beings for experimental purposes, became the macabre canvas of unscrupulous research. Without mercy or anesthesia, this cruel form of scientific exploration was carried out on thousands of victims, mostly Chinese communist prisoners. The heartless scientists wanted to experiment with all types of bodies, so they not only worked on adult men, but included elderly farmers, but also molested women and children. The sequence was a Dantesque scenario, where the horrors of vivisection were inflicted in their maximum power. Infected with deadly diseases such as cholera and plague, prisoners became involuntary test subjects in a grotesque quest to understand the causes and effects of that medical diagnosis. Their organs, removed while they were still beating, became objects of study to analyze the effects without post-mortem decomposition. The horror reached new horizons when, for example, subjects assigned to the study of gangrene were subjected to extreme amputations without any type of anesthetic or prior treatment. The objective was to study the phenomenon with the least amount of interference possible, causing pain and outrage never seen in the history of medicine. Limbs separated and then joined to the opposite side of the body formed a spectacle of cruelty that defied logic and morality. Others were victims of aberrations that consisted of crushing or burning the limbs of prisoners to analyze the wounds. In other cases, their circulation was cut off on purpose to take the captives' bodies to the limit of human resistance, and thus study them. In the tragic epilogue of this grotesque experiment, once the bodies were exhausted by merciless torture, death came by a volley of gunshots or a lethal injection. This happened in the best of cases, since other times the macabre scientists kept the patients in agony until the last breath of life to study every detail of their dying fate. Lethal weapons. In the gloomy facilities of this experimentation center, the machinery of death was put to the test with unprecedented cruelty, working relentlessly. The expansionist ambitions of the Imperial Army required an arsenal as sophisticated as it was deadly. To that end, they had to create the most effective and bloodthirsty tools. What could be better than having thousands and thousands of prisoners at your disposal on which to test these elements of death? Bayonets, swords, and knives became instruments of horror, studied in detail at the cost of the lives of their prisoners. The metal edge, now impregnated with human suffering, stood as a symbol of the ruthless brutality that characterized this clandestine unit. Another leading tool in wound and burn tests were flamethrowers. This sinister creation unleashed a hellish curtain of fire on the victims' bodies, causing them irreparable damage and extreme pain. The skin, exposed or covered, served as a test element to measure the devastation of this destructive device. Desperation took hold of those who, chained and powerless, became cooked meat in this cruel experimentation.
まず毒ガスで殺され、それから息のある人は機関銃で撃たれたりして、そして遺体はバーベキューのようにという、やった人そのものがそういう言葉を使っていますけれど、庭に鉄の板を渡してその上で焼いたと。焼ききれない人はすんがりという皮がありますけど、その皮に捨てた。
The horror seemed to have no limits for Japanese scientists. Every new idea or assumption that appeared in their twisted minds was carried out with both professionalism and cruelty. The installation of gas chambers, where prisoners were subjected to blistering agents and nerve gases, was routine work in which the most efficient, cheap, and deadly chemicals were sought. Death came in insidious ways, while the scientists of Unit 731 impassively observed the lethal effects of their creations. In one of the many macabre exercises, Prolonged exposure to X-rays became another method of torture. Thousands of test subjects were sterilized and annihilated. Their bodies were taken to the extreme by a twisted science that explored the limits of the prisoners' resistance, until ending their lives. Each weapon studied, each test subject sacrificed, told a story of limitless cruelty, where the search for knowledge strayed onto a path of inhuman horror. Venereal diseases. In the midst of the twisted scientific maelstrom, an even more sinister search unfolded in the ranks of the Imperial Japanese Army. The topic of sexuality has always been taboo in Eastern society, and even more so the diseases strictly related to this practice. Therefore, having a group of prisoners to subdue, without scruples, guilt, or inhibitions, was a terrain as fertile as it was perverse. The objective of the unit scientists was to unravel the mysteries of syphilis, and in that search cruelty reached unimaginable levels. Male prisoners infected with this venereal disease were imposed a macabre order to sexually abuse other prisoners, both men and women, for the purpose of observing and controlling the development of the infection. This gruesome practice was repeated over and over again until exposure to the disease was firmly established. Systematic rape thus became an inhumane method of research, where not only the lives of prisoners, but also their dignity were sacrificed on the dark altar of medical experimentation. In this horror story, syphilis ceased to be simply a disease and became a cruel tool in the hands of those who, in their search for knowledge, completely lost their moral compass. The cries of the victims echoed on the walls of the chambers in which, repeatedly, the captives suffered these aberrations at the hands of their countrymen, forced by the infamous imperial investigators. Human limits. Another fascination that Japanese scientists wanted to explore was studying the limits of human physical capacity. In the cold and merciless barracks of Unit 731, the search for knowledge became a nightmare of cruelty never seen before. Testing began with locked subjects from whom food and water were taken away for long periods of time. These prisoners were converted into silent witnesses of their own fight for survival. The researchers' question was as simple as it was morbid. How long can a human being resist the violent deprivations of hunger and thirst? That was the question that hovered in each of the cells, while the scientists, impassive, observed the limits of human resistance, translated into desperate screams and dying silences of the prisoners.
苦しい声を上げてました。だから死んだ理由といえば悶絶苦しんで悶絶死ですね。
In their desire to study the reaction of bodies to lacerations caused by accidents, Japanese scientists were as ingenious as they were bloodthirsty. They turned tied prisoners into targets for heavy objects that were dropped on them to injure them. The roar of the impact, which broke bones and tissues, became the soundtrack of the brutality of these experiments. Another physical investigation to which the captives were subjected had the ultimate goal of finding solutions to the risks that Japanese pilots ran on war flights. The sinister thing of all is that the imperial investigators were going to pay the price for the answers with the blood of Chinese prisoners. The study of G-forces, physical forces of the dizzying world of aviation and parachuting, became a fatal dance in large centrifuges built especially for the occasion. Human beings, loaded into these mechanisms of scientific torture, spun at impressive speeds until they lost consciousness or, worse still, lost their lives. The scenes recounted speak of the prisoners' dismantled bodies and gray matter coming out of their ears and noses. Between 10 and 15 G, centrifugal force became a deadly phenomenon, leaving behind a trail of suffering and despair. In these ways, Unit 731 explored the darkest corners of human corporeality, using prisoners of war as mere instruments of its twisted desire for knowledge. Experiments with women. As was customary in Eastern societies of the time, women were considered inferior, which is why they ended up being an object of study highly coveted by the Japanese. Female prisoners of childbearing age were to be victims of unimaginable atrocities, among which forced pregnancy stood out. This ruthless act had a sordid purpose: to test various weapons on their bodies, turning them into subjects of experimentation and generating various irreparable traumas. The captives, already vulnerable in their confinement, were subjected to this chain of horrors, not only because they were prisoners, but because they were women. Pregnant inmates, among other practices, were infected with various diseases, exposed to chemical weapons, gunshot wounds, injuries from accidents and shrapnel fragments. Their bodies, carriers of innocent lives, were transformed into study canvases for the depraved curiosity of the scientists of Unit 731. When the moment of truth arrived, the pregnant bellies were opened with clinical coldness to see how they had affected the pregnancy, torture, and mistreatment. Although it may seem incredible, fetuses, innocent and defenseless, became objects of research. Each incision, each study, left its mark of inhumanity and brutality. Among pregnant prisoners, those affected by syphilis were of special interest to researchers. The disease, previously a mere pathology, was transformed into another tool in the twisted arsenal of Unit 731. One of the plans of this macabre group was to have Chinese women contaminated with the disease infiltrate brothels or towns and generate massive infections in the enemy soldier. These plans, as incredible as they were bloodthirsty, were a fundamental part of the objective of this secret group. However, this was always denied by the Japanese, their imperial army and their leaders.
Was there ever a time when you thought the work you were doing at 731 was wrong, was inhumane?
No.
All official records of these atrocities were hidden, either out of shame or to avoid paying the costs of their inhuman conduct. In 2018, the country's National Archives have revealed the names of 3,607 individuals in response to the request of Professor Katsuo Nishiyama of Shiga University of Medical Sciences. The lawyer, after years and years of investigation, managed to declassify archives of the armed forces that hid these facts. This act, which could fuel public debate over Japanese atrocities in occupied China during World War II, represents the first time that the list of almost all members of Unit 731 has been officially revealed. The document exposed to the Society, dated January 1, 1945, catalogs the members of the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, revealing the names, ranks, and contact information of more than 1,000 Army doctors, as well as dozens of doctors, surgeons, nurses, and engineers who were part of the horror. Although Japan had already against its will recognized the existence of the unit in the late 1990s, silence continued about the details of its activities. The narratives about these actions have been constructed from testimonies of former members, photographs, and documentary evidence. They are all as creepy as they are revealing. The prisoners, contemptuously called trunks by their torturers, were subjected to all the indignities that we have been describing, but it is feared that there were even more practices that have not yet come to light. There is still one question to answer: who was the evil mastermind behind this cruel research center? In the deepest shadows of World War II emerged the enigmatic and sinister figure of Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, master leader of Unit 731 of the Japanese Empire. His story is a chilling journey through the darkness of the human mind, where ethical boundaries melt away before the insatiable thirst for power and twisted knowledge. Born in 1892 in Shibayama, Japan, Ishii distinguished himself early as a brilliant military doctor. However, his brilliance slipped into the abyss of immorality when the ambition and militaristic ideology of the Japanese Empire led him to direct the feared division, a machinery of suffering and trials against all human nature.
まあ、私たち下の者から見ると非常に怖い人でした。まあ、気違いじみたいな人でしたがね、例えば、軍機風紀の検閲で来るとかあるときに、他の部隊行ったときに、突然衛兵に殴りかかる。
Heishi, with his scientific gaze, guided the unit toward biological weapons research in a ruthless pursuit of military advantage. His scientific genius was overshadowed by his inhumane tactics. Under his command, Unit 731 became a laboratory of horror, where the line between science and sadism was completely blurred. The brutal experiments perpetrated on Chinese prisoners of war and civilians during his reign have been etched as indelible atrocities in history. In addition to the already narrated Vivsections without anesthesia and the deliberate spread of lethal diseases, the ruthless search for biological perfection and the superior race was also highlighted. All of these activities paint a portrait of a man whose actions shake even the darkest pages of war. As Japan hurtled toward defeat in 1945, Ishii attempted to erase traces of his crimes by ordering the elimination of all records, prisoner remains, and evidence that left any trace of his activities. After the war, the Americans granted Ishii and all his scientists the privilege of not being judged to access all the information of his hair-raising research. The Japanese lieutenant, far from facing trial for his crimes, found a new life, marked by impunity, which adds a chilling epilogue to the story of a man whose ruthless acts continue to resonate in the collective consciousness of all of Asia. However, some members bear repentant testimony of his atrocities.
中国の人たちには謝りたいことが主なんですよ。本当のことを言って、本当に中国の人たちは迷惑かけてる。ね。罪としてみんなにお詫びをしなきゃいけないっていうのが本音です。
Dr. Harris Sheldon, a historian specializing in the case in his harrowing account, estimates that between 10,000 and 12,000 prisoners were lost in the shadows of these ruthless biological experiments. In this way, Unit 731, in its twisted quest for knowledge, left a legacy of unimaginable suffering and an indelible stain on the darkest pages of history. Despite how dark these experiments were, it is still true that many of the results that these investigations yielded were scientific advances that are currently used. It is worth asking, have these twisted acts of evil been key to the development of science as we know it today? This sinister question floats among the ghostly screams of the victims who, to this day, continue to ask for justice. So we are reaching the end of today's overwhelming video. We thank you for having come this far, and we look forward to seeing you in the next installments of military history.